Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode during this coronavirus quarantine situation. Filming this in mid-April. I'm sorry, and just gonna try to keep bringing you some interesting content. So thank you to everyone who sent in questions earlier. I'm personally hoping to keep this sort of chain going, do these episodes every month or so. So feel free to comment below with more questions on anything really related to tea or anything like that. Happy to answer those, hopefully on a different episode. So this episode, I am basically bringing on all those questions that you've asked. Gonna start with some more general questions on specific topics like Pu'erh storage, rinsing, things like that. And then I'm going to get to sort of specific teas and tea recommendations and things like that a little later on. So so if you're interested in just watching that part, go to maybe halfway through the video or so. And I am reserving all the questions on teaware, which tend to not exactly be the questions that are perfectly geared towards someone that focuses more on tea like myself. But I do hope to comment a little bit on those sometime in the future. So keep on posting those questions. I may do some sort of specific episode just devoted to Q&A on teaware a little bit later on. All right, so the first question comes from a tea friend of mine, Atlas, who is asking, what is Pu'erh storage in Pu'erh or oolong? So good question. And so I'm going to basically tackle this in two different ways which storage can be bad and what it tastes like. So for oolong, it's usually thought that the storage can be bad when the tea picks up excess humidity. So oolong definitely ages a bit differently than pu'erh, at least that's the school of thought. And so you want to basically avoid the tea picking up too much humidity. So you want to put it in tins, sealed away basically. I'm not sure, vacuum sealing you'll find mixed information on whether that's enough to age it or not, or whether that's that will just sort of trap it in time. So different schools of thought there. But it's one area in which, in many ways, the Western climate, in theory, is better suited towards aging it than something like pu'erh, where we have to come up with these funny contraptions and things like that. So yeah, I'd say that is kind of how oolong can be poorly stored, is if you stored it in a bathtub or something like that, or in just an excess humid environment and didn't seal it properly, and it just picked up humidity over time. So taste-wise, this will sort of manifest itself in sourness. And you can, of course, have varying degrees of sourness. There are also varying degrees that people are willing to accept sourness. Some people like a certain amount of tart flavor in their aged oolong, and other people don't like any sort of sourness whatsoever, and it's sort of known to take on this really, or certain aged oolongs at least, this really plummy, rich, sweet profile. I personally really like that profile as well. Okay, so that answers oolong. So what about pu'erh? So pu'erh, basically everyone agrees that you can have pu'erh storage. I mean, there are a variety of ways that it can be bad, but the two basic ones are too wet and too dry. And where those fit depends a lot on just who you are talking to and what their personal preferences are, where their biases might be. So too wet, it will basically taste a little bit like wet wood, a little bit just mulchy. The brew will tend to be very dark. The easiest way to tell if something is on the wetter end is to brew out the whole session, dump out the leaves, and see how dark they are. If it's like black or brownish, then the storage at least at some time had some amount of humidity there. But of course with pu'erh storage, there's also definitely a distinct possibility of being too dry, and I think this is what a lot of Westerners end up worrying about, just because our climates are cooler and end up resulting in a little bit of drier storage just naturally. So these teas can lose their aroma, the astringency and the roughness could be picked up on. So it may actually increase in roughness and in astringency. And I do think that is a real concern for Western storage. And of course, you could swing too far the other way and end up with too wet of storage. I think a lot depends exactly. Obviously, something like storing Pu'erh also in a bathtub would result in too wet of storage. But storing it just open air in a place like Nevada or Arizona where it's dry already, or just someplace where it's blasting air conditioning and the humidity is just naturally low, that could result in storage that is too dry. All right, so next up we have a question from Claire Paley, who asks, I would love to know more details about rinsing tea. When is it appropriate? How long do you steep it for when trying to rinse? What heat, etc.? I'd find this very informative. Thank you. As with many topics of tea, there's a lot of different thoughts here. I tend to follow the most basic approach. I can't say I have researched this topic heavily, but I basically use the same water that I'm going to steep the tea with, so same temperature, and I'll just give it a quick rinse. Some people will do a little bit longer rinse, and sometimes this can sort of serve the purpose of breaking up a cake or just getting to so for instance, a rolled oolong or a very compressed pu'erh, getting to that sort of like letting it open up a little bit more. There's different ways you could do that. You could also give it a rinse and just let it sit for a while. So you could just give it a flash rinse and then just let the tea sit in the heated up pot or gaiwan or brewing vessel for 20 minutes even, and that might also accomplish the same goal. So there are different thoughts there. One other thing that a rinse will do is it will heat up the vessel, and that will just result in those initial steeps, or at least if you are to steep it pretty consecutively after, being a little bit hotter. And that can be important when you're trying to, especially for more aged teas or teas where you're really trying to push it, and the less delicate teas. That can be important to just extracting the maximum amount of flavor that you want to get. So also something to keep in mind. For something like green teas, I think you probably don't want to hit it with a boiling water rinse. If you're brewing it sort of in this style, you're probably not brewing it at boiling anyways. Yeah, and I'm talking about sort of this style of tea as opposed to grandpa style tea, just to be clear. Okay, so Jug Pan asks how to age different types of tea with consideration of humidity. Which type of clay teapot works best for each tea? We'll talk about that later. And lastly, what are you currently aging? All right, so some good questions here. So how to age different types of tea with consideration of humidity. So I think this depends a lot on what you mean here, and I think it's complicated. I think for most people, they don't want to set up different sorts of storage just for the sake of more practicality and pragmatism. I guess in theory, you could have multiple Pu'erhs going where you have one that's different parameters than another one. But in the case of storing, for most people, I think most people, simpler is better. But I think it's still a little bit interesting to think about. And I think a lot can depend sort of on your palate. So for me, something like an 8582 recipe from Munghai Tea Factory, I might be okay drinking that after 10 or 15 years of moderate Taiwan storage. Whereas something like a 7542 might be still a little bit too strong for me at that range. And I prefer more 15 to 20 years or a little bit more aggressive storage. So I think it can depend a little bit on tea. I don't think that's something that we should totally not take into account. As far as teas that I'm aging, I think I brought a lot of the raw pu'erh I bought recently onto the episode recently. Something like the 2010 8582 is sitting in my big Euro cave, aging away. Not something I intend to drink terribly often, at least for the next couple of years. 2006 8582, I am drinking that regularly, but it also is definitely something where it's going to be aged. The 2013 Shaguan Love Forever Paper Tong, available from Teas We Like, as well as a couple other vendors, is a tea that I am also aging. So a lot of different teas. 2004 Gongfu as well. And I end up aging a lot of teas just because I own a lot of it, so it's just going to be aging. Yeah, those are a few of them. All right, so Agent Mulder asks, any tips for travel Gongfu brewing, specifically how to keep your water hot enough for Pu'erh without a kettle? So I think this depends, and I think it depends on what's at your disposal. Obviously, something like a stovetop is ideal, where you can heat up water that way. If you're camping or something like that, maybe that's not possible. I do think for traveling, one really useful thing to have is a thermos. So I use a Zoji Rushi, but there's all kinds of thermoses that can be perfectly effective. And that's just a good way to heat up the tea, and they're very effective at keeping it hot for a while. Usually with the thermos, you'll want to fill it up all the way. You're going to have less heat loss, I believe, if it's closer to full than if it's like half full or something like that. So most of the challenges, I would say, in Gongfu brewing is exactly what Agent Mulder said, just getting that water hot enough for hot enough without a kettle. Certain teas will do better. I was recently in Spain and only had a microwave to heat up the tea, so heat up the water, so I had to do that, and I was pretty much ended up brewing just oolong during that time. All right, question from Guy Wagner. He is confused by traditional storage. He doubts he could tell the difference of tea by sight, maybe by taste. All right, so good question. I think the easiest way to tell traditional storage is by the wet leaf after you've brewed it out. So what I would recommend is similar to that other question about telling wet storage and stuff like that, is to take the tea after you've brewed it out, dump it out if it's raw Pu'erh, and you'll be able to see that if it's really dark, then it probably had pretty strong humidity, which is one of the characteristics of traditional storage. So that might be a good way to tell. The taste also, it can depend. A lot depends on when you are tasting the tea as far as traditional storage goes. A lot of it can actually taste quite clean depending on the actual storage, if it's been properly aired out. For instance, if it was stored in a more intense basement facility for a couple of years, but it's been like 14 or 15 years where it's basically been aging in a more dry environment, then that could definitely be clean, pretty clean tasting. So you can't always tell by sort of like that mulchiness, which also can be quite subjective person to person. All right, ANJF asked, they said, tea has been a huge comfort to me during this time, and your videos are always appreciated. Thank you. My question is, have you found any teas that have a pronounced mellowing, sedating, grounding effect? Anything that's available. I've had a lot of time to Gongfu, but getting wrecked on Sheng isn't exactly the best way to fight anxiety. I've got a couple earthy shows that I've been loving, but just wanted your input. So yeah, good question. I think, again, I hate to revert to this each time, but it depends a lot on the person. For me, I actually probably experienced tea in a similar way to ANJF, at least from what they described. Shengs, especially younger ones, tend to get me more amped up and ready to go. Even stuff that's fairly mellow, like Iwu teas and things that I enjoy drinking. So I think that's one of the many reasons that I don't tend to drink young Shengs terribly often, before or after the pandemic crisis. And so for me, oolongs and ripe Pu'erhs are usually good choices. But Garrett, I know, who is a regular tea friend of mine and someone I meet up with, or at least met up with regularly, tells me often that oolong is the tea that gets him more amped up. So I think it does depend a lot on person. The one thing that I have found is pretty consistent person to person is that ripe Pu'erh is very mellow, aged tea as well, and they tend to be, these are still caffeinated beverages, so a lot, if you end up drinking too much of it, you could still definitely get a little amped up on it, but for me, those are good options. Also, exercising, if you end up getting too amped up, could be a good way to sort of cut through that energy. Scott of Yunnan Sourcing, I know, who ends up, of course, drinking tons and tons of tea, a lot of young Sheng Pu'erh. I know he is pretty active as far as like moving around and going for regular runs and things like that. So those are ways that if you do really want to drink those sheng tea, can help to cut down on sort of the amped up feeling and the anxiety that can result from it. All right, so here's a question from Chris. I have a white tea aging experiment going on, and after a little under a year, I'm seeing 2011 Chaumet darken significantly from many copper orange leaves into a brown. Being the tea was already from 2011, I'm surprised my having it aging for less than a year has had such a pronounced change. 60 to 65% relative humidity and 19 to 26 Celsius in low airflow dark conditions. Thoughts? For me, this is still, I guess I would say for white tea and aging, I'm still at the phase of exploration and observation. I'm personally still not aging any white tea, so I can't speak from any sort of experience, but the amount of anecdotes we have coming out, it's still relatively on the small end. So my sort of vision for what can happen as far as aging white tea is still pretty wide. I think it's still sort of TBD what is the proper way to do it. I've heard no airflow, or I've heard that it's better to do it somewhat like Pu'erh, and I've heard others say that's not good. So I don't know. I mean, I would sort of cede this sort of question towards Oolong Owl, and the episodes that we filmed with her earlier. It is interesting to hear that these are relatively high humidity conditions for white tea, so it's interesting to hear. And I do think that one thing that does seem to be consistent is that the tea does seem to age quicker than Pu'erh. And it's possible to have fairly significantly aged white tea in probably like 5 to 10 years, depending on the tea. What also I recall Oolong Owl Char saying during the episode is that some of these lower grade white teas like Chaumet can age a little bit faster than something higher grade like Silver Needle or Baimudan. All right, so here is a question from Elias. How about some levity in these dark times? What about 3 available teas that score very high on the mom test? Or if the mom test is too much of a sensitive subject, how about 3 teas that are good ones to share with a novice drinker? Stay safe over there. All right, great. So for me, these teas for a novice drinker will not be raw Pu'erh at all, and they won't be ripe usually. I would say one good one for me that I've been drinking lately is the Tea Home Shanli Shi. It's nothing terribly special, but for something that costs 10-11 cents a gram, it's really, really good value, and it's something that I enjoy drinking. I'll serve it for my wife, I'll serve it for guests, and it's just a good way to also just start a session with something fresh and nice. It does have a little bit of a darker edge than your normal high mountain tea, but that's also kind of a feature for me as opposed to a bug. So it's not the greenest of green high mountain teas, but it has a lot of those characteristics still, so it gives you that sort of fresh floral burst, and I really enjoy it. For a contrast to that, I would say a Wui origin yancha. I personally like their Laokong Shuixian, and that's a tea that maybe is best suited to drink a year or 2 after it's harvested, in my opinion. But it has a really nice minerally taste to it. So that would be probably another one of my recommendations, and a good contrast to sort of that that greener, less roasted flavor of the Shanli. And a third I would recommend that might be a little bit harder to seek out, but I definitely do recommend everyone seeks out, is some aged oolong that is not roasted to death. I think perhaps one good option, and I don't know currently what they stock, but in my experience they've usually had 1 or 2 decent ones, is Floating Leaves tea. So check out if they have any good aged oolongs. You can always message her on email or Facebook. They're always very helpful. But something that can sort of allow you to explore the really easygoing and very, very pleasant, in my opinion, profile of an aged oolong. I think it's a tea that, despite people like Marshall and talking about it quite a lot, and even myself to some extent, I think it's still pretty unexplored. And if it's something you haven't tasted, definitely check it out. Not just for novice drinkers, but I do think it is friendly in a way that Pu'erh and Pu'erh, both young, ripe, and aged, isn't always for the novice drinker. Alright, so getting into these more specific tea questions like the last one. So this is from JP. I really like to see more reviews on everyday teas at the low budget range, especially with the overwhelming choice of tool chas on the market, both sheng and shu. There's very little accessible information on this stuff that I can find at least. Also cheaper everyday brick teas like the 3 Cranes Lubao or 7562 Dai bricks and Tibetan Flame, etc. I like to see more examples of cheap and premium tool cha as everyday teas, especially in this time of crisis when nobody has the kind of money to buy expensive stuff. Good news, JP. You inspired me to buy a couple cheaper tool chas from MXT on Taobao. Still waiting for those to arrive, but I will try to bring those onto the show when they do and let you know what I think. It's been a while since I've sampled more of those teas. But one tea that I'm actually drinking today is the 2006 Gold Ribbon from MXT. And I know this tea can be a little bit hit or miss for some people, but I enjoy it. It costs about $9 or $10, I think, per tool cha. Now, maybe it's slightly more. So that's 100 grams. So it's like relatively inexpensive. This session of 6.2 grams, I guess, is something like 62 cents. So in my view, that's pretty reasonable. So if you're drinking tool chas, I guess that tends to be more factory tea. You can definitely find stuff like the Jiaji tool, which is sort of one of the classics that Chagon makes very often. That's even 15 years old for around $10 or so. If you go to MXT, you can also find a few years younger for significantly less money. So I will try to bring on some of these teas. For sure. I am not necessarily a huge fan of the Tibetan Flame series. I've had some that are just, to me, to go back up to that earlier comment, a little bit too aggro, a little bit too anxiety, sweat-inducing for me to enjoy on sort of a regular basis. I've enjoyed some 90s ones, but those, I have no idea where to buy them myself even. So so it might be a little bit out of luck if you need that sort of a little bit more mellowness like me. So I will try to bring a couple more of those teas on. One that I also recently brought on is the 2000 Monghai 8582, which is still pretty cheap. It cost me 6-7 cents a gram, I think, under 10 cents a gram. And it is still quite strong, but I think it's at a place that if you are into the factory teas, you could enjoy it sort of on a semi-regular basis now. And the last question was someone interested in everyday teas as my budget shrinks. For me, everyday teas tend to be semi-aged pu'ers and oolongs. Named a couple good oolongs that I like personally to drink earlier. So Tea Home, definitely check them out. Inexpensive teas. Their Legend of Dongding is really cheap and decent. The Shanli Shi as well is definitely worth checking out. So you can get those both for their price range tends to be like 6 or 7 cents a gram to 12 cents a gram. So really, really reasonable for the price there. Ripe Pu'erh is also a great option if you enjoy the profile and are trying to drink tea on a good budget. I like Scat's Yunnan sourcing ripes. I also like white teas. Dai is also a great go-to there. So those are things that I'm all perfectly okay drinking regularly. As far as semi-aged raw goes, I would definitely recommend checking out the Yunnan sourcing Guangdong and Sichuan Bana category. And I am mainly speaking towards my taste here. I don't feel like I should be recommending young Pu'erh at this point because it's not something that I do drink. Essence of Tea as well, I know has recently released a couple new teas that are around $100 or so per cake. So if that's within your budget, I'd recommend that. And Teas We Like, of course, which tends to be a little bit pricier, but I think they're really good about their selection. So I would tend to trust them to curate their their offerings quite well. So they have a brick there that's, I think, only $30 for 250 grams. Have not tried it, but it's probably a pretty good bet. And their 2008 Monghai 8582 is also a pretty solid one as well. So yeah, I think that concludes this In-Betweenisode. Hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed it. Please ask more questions below. Want to make this sort of a regular occurrence, and thank you all for tuning in. Hope everyone is staying safe and drinking lots of tea during this quarantine and this global pandemic. And I will see you all soon. Cheers.